Hey, what is up guys? This is Nishi from MST.TV here, back with another Market Watch episode. Today, I'm sure you guys have already guessed it, but we are talking about the ban list aftermath. And holy crap, I think this might actually be one of the best ban lists that we've ever had. Like, yes, there were a couple of things that could have been handled a bit differently, or maybe they were unexpected. And yes, I am sad that Shavara is hit, but I do think that the list made a lot of good changes that will shake up the format in a positive way. Also, interesting thing to note here is that there were 25 changes to the list, and it just so happens that we are celebrating 25 years of Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm pretty sure that's not a coincidence at all. Anyways, as per usual, today we are going to look at the cards that were actually on the list itself and talk about how those prices are behaving, and then within the next couple of days we'll talk about some related cards that are trending as a direct result of the list. Let's get started. Okay, first up, let's look at Iyar, the World Chalice Justice Iyar. Now, Iyar is a card that actually had a very short life in terms of being used within the format. This card came out in Dark Neostorm, which came out in the TCG in May of 2019, but it was pretty quickly banned in January of 2020. This is because of the Master Rule change in April of 2020. Prior to that, when you summoned a Fusion, Synchro, or Xyz monster from your extra deck, it had to be summoned to either your extra monster zone or a zone opened up by a Link Monster's Link Arrow, but this was adjusted to the rules that we now have in the game today. Obviously back then, Konami was afraid of some extra deck monsters that were allowable under the previous Master Rule that would have potentially been broken following the changes, as we saw hits to cards like ABC Dragon Buster and Totally Awesome. And while cards like those were gradually allowed back into the game, it ended up taking us several years to get back the preemptively hit Iyar. Now, to be fair, Iyar is a really powerful card. It's a generic level 5 Synchro Tuner monster that on summon searches for a World Legacy card, and if it's sent from the field to the graveyard, you also get to special summon a World Chalice monster from your deck or graveyard. Therefore, this card is a useful combo piece that can potentially fetch you 2 additional pieces, and I actually remember thinking that it was pretty reasonable for this card to be hit back then. This card didn't really have a chance to be used all that much in the game, but I think that players were sort of thinking of different ways that they would eventually be able to abuse it under the new Master Rule, but it just never really happened. Fast forward to today's game, and I have mixed feelings about it. Yes, the card does generate a lot of advantage, but at the same time, I don't think there's too many decks right now that are able or looking to make level 5 synchros, and even if you do, you're probably playing some underwhelming cards as targets just to turn on the effects of Iyar. A card like World Legacy Succession is obviously pretty generically useful, but the World Chalice monsters generally aren't that amazing. However, there's still a lot that can happen, and I think some players are thinking of Dragon Link as a deck that could potentially use Iyar. They make some interesting synchro plays, and you'd have to go into this card prior to locking yourself with cards like Pisty and Rocket Tracer. As a freshly unbanned card, this was one of the first cards to shoot up in price on the day of the ban list dropping. Early in the day, this card was moving for around $20 to $25. Since then, it's really cooled down to about the $13 to $14 mark, which I think is pretty reasonable. Because of how short this card's life was, it only has that one secret rare printing from Dark Neostorm. Hopefully we'll see it get reprinted soon, and hopefully we'll see some deck use this card and the other World Legacy pieces, and finally give this card a chance to see some more meta play. Next up, I guess this is sort of a blast from the past, it is Snatch Steal. So Snatch Steal is a pretty iconic card. I think it's one of those cards that we just sort of assumed would always be banned forever, and actually this is something that Konami has already tried unbanning. Back in January of 2015, Konami put Snatch Steal back to 1 for a single format, but it was put back to 0 pretty shortly after, as the card was just way too strong. But then again, the game was very different back then. For context, that's the same list that put Artifact Morozhak back to 1, and finally put Mermail Abyss Gun, Reborn Tengu, and Blackwing Gale the Whirlwind to unlimited status. I remember back then just thinking, what the heck is Konami thinking, putting Snatch Steal to 1, and it was as degenerate as you'd think it is in a slower paced game. I remember players would just top deck Snatch Steal, take your opponent's monster, and attack for game out of nowhere. Of course, looking ahead to today's game, Snatch Steal is admittedly not nearly as strong. We have cards like Change of Heart and Triple Tactics Talent, both legal, both of which are probably better than Snatch Steal, and then we also have cards that a lot of people are choosing to run, such as Book of Moon and Book of Eclipse, both of which help players play around Snatch Steal as well. Sure, maybe someone will try to do something with like a Snatch Steal and Hidden Armory or something, but really I think it's just going to be a one of tech that some really dedicated going second decks are going to try to cheese games with, but it also just might not even see play given that you can't search it with something like Triple Tactics Thrust. Now, in terms of price, this card is honestly all over the place. The card was printed in several structure decks, and it was also a rare in one of the battle packs. So for all of those low-end printings, you're looking at anywhere from like $2 to $5, maybe $7 depending on condition. And then for the battle pack Starfoil, you're probably going to have to pay around like $10. For the ultras, there's like 4 different listings on TCG Player for Magic Ruler and Spell Ruler because of the different editions. Essentially, you're probably paying around $30 to $40 for a near mint unlimited copy of Snatch Steal, though even as I'm filming this, there are people that are starting to undercut one another, and it's bringing the price down bit by bit. If you want an MRL first ed, I think the cheapest one up there right now is around $150. I think the most they've sold for is around $120. But yeah, the way that the game is played in 2024 versus 2015 is very different, and I'm definitely not expecting Snatch Steal to be nearly as impactful on the game this time around. The one thing I would note though is that there are players saying online that Snatch Steal can steal an X-Perle Noir with more than 5 materials, which sounds interesting. I don't know if that's true or not, or if it's one of those things where you're just going to have to ask your head judge before an event, but that might be an important interaction to note if you're looking to either pick this card up or use that as a selling point. So there's one other freshly unbanned card here, and it's admittedly a lot less interesting than the other couple. This one is Orcust Harp Horror. So this card is of course famous from back in TOS format, TOS standing for Thunder Dragon, Orcust, Sky Striker, and Salamangreat. A lot of players remember that format very fondly. Harp Horror was the card that really let Orcust be Orcust before they had suffered from the loss of Nightmare Mermaid, but the deck was still able to play until Harp was banned and the deck was definitely dead. Harp was definitely the best of the Orcust monsters to banish from your graveyard, as it allowed you to special summon an Orcust monster from your deck, but then locked you into dark monsters for the rest of the turn. The Orcust end boards weren't anything really crazy, they just had like a Dingirsu and a Galatea, maybe a Crescendo set, but if you had access to Babel to make your Orcust cards all quick effects, then they were actually pretty annoying to deal with. Now to be honest, I feel like Harp Horror could have been unbanned at any time within the last few years and no one would have really cared all that much. The main thing is just the nostalgia. A lot of players are looking back at Harp and really just want to be able to use it again, but realistically, it's not going to do anything in terms of the format. Harp Horror has 2 different printings. One is a rare from Soul Fusion that you should be able to get for like $1, and then it also got a super rare upgrade in an OTS tournament pack. The supers were up at $8 to $10 on Tuesday morning when the list dropped, but even by the end of the day they were around $3 to $4 already, so players were definitely offloading them to try and take advantage of all the hype surrounding the card being newly unbanned. As cool as the unbanning is for players that are big fans of the deck, I ultimately think it's just not going to do anything, so if you can find someone who really wants it and is willing to pay up for the card, I'd just go ahead and move it, because chances are that in a couple of weeks, no one's really going to care about this card anymore. Moving on to some cards that are no longer limited, the first one is Upstart Goblin. So Upstart Goblin's a pretty unassuming card. You draw a card and your opponent gains 1,000 life points. It may seem like it just breaks you even, but gives your opponent more life points. But for a while, absolutely everyone was running this card at 2 or 3. The idea, popularized by Patrick Hoban back in 2015, was that you wanted your decks to be as consistent as possible, and therefore as small as possible. Essentially, running 3 Upstart Goblins means that you are running a 37 card deck, so you should be able to see your key starters and or extenders more consistently. And this was a really big thing for a while, especially because Patrick Hoban actually saw a lot of competitive success at the time. Now in today's game though, even though consistency is still just as and arguably more important, and Upstart Goblin is now at 3, I don't think it's going to see too much play. First, Upstart Goblin plays into Droll and Lockbird, which is something that seems to be in everyone's sideboards right now. Secondly, it conflicts with Pot of Prosperity, a really useful card that's seeing play in a bunch of different decks. And finally, there are a lot of strategies that are actually running more than 40 cards, as decks like Unchained and Rescue Ace consistently run between 42 and 44 cards, so adding in 3 Upstart Goblins actually doesn't do all that much. It might be the case that some players will add in an Upstart Goblin or 2 if they can't find a card that they want to use, and then Upstart becomes a pretty solid option to side out, but we'll have to just wait and see how the format evolves. Now price-wise, Upstart has actually always been a pretty in-demand card. Even after it got limited, there have always been players wanting copies of Upstart Goblin for things like Time Wizard formats. Obviously the most expensive version is the Turbo Pack Super Rare, which is currently sitting at around $80 each. Next, there is an ultra rare version from Legendary Collection Yugi's World. Those are pretty clean, they're sitting just under the $20 mark right now. The most accessible holo version of the card is the super rare from Secret Slayers. This one wasn't like a hard to pull super or anything. In fact, I think it got mixed in with people's bulk a lot of the time. It's just that over time, the product got more and more scarce, so those copies are now between $6 to $8 each. Finally, the card does have a rare printing from Maximum Gold Eldorado, and then a bunch of different common versions. Realistically, you're paying anywhere from $3 to $5 per copy of the card. Now, as iconic as Upstart Goblin is, and as much as it has contributed to a lot of basic deck building principles, I don't think that Upstart Goblin will have the same impact or see as much play now as it did back then. If we switch to a format where Droll isn't a great card, then I could maybe see it creeping in here and there, but until then I'd probably just look at moving your copies of Upstart Goblin while the value is so inflated. On to the next card, which went from limited to semi-limited and is probably the card I'm most excited to see come off the list. It's Dino Wrestler Pankratops. Pankratops coming off the list was a big change that I think a lot of players were hoping for, but maybe didn't actually think we'd end up seeing. Pankratops is sort of an alternative to Kashtira Fenrir. I think some players just look at Fenrir as being purely an upgrade, but there are some times where maybe Pankratops is more useful. The two cards are fairly different. Pankratops requires your opponent to control a monster, and for you to control no monsters to special summon this card, while Fenrir can just be summoned as long as you control no monsters, and of course Fenrir can search for another copy of itself, whereas Pankratops can't. However, while Fenrir requires your opponent to activate a monster effect, or for Fenrir to declare an attack before you're able to use its effect to banish anything, Pankratops is just a quick effect that you can choose to activate to destroy a card on the field. Therefore, if your opponent tries to imperm your Pankratops, you can chain Pankratops to still get rid of an opponent's card, Pankratops can attack, and then after the battle, tribute itself to pop something in the battle phase as well, so a bit more flexibility, and of course, Pankratops can actually destroy face-down cards as well. Now, being a fan favorite, Pankratops did get a ton of attention and was actually one of the more notable cards to peel off of the list, but fortunately, it has both a common printing from Soul Fusion and a rare printing from Ancient Guardians, both of which are extremely accessible. For noteworthy high-end printings though, the collector's rare is obviously the biggest target. Those are like $160 to $170 per copy, and then it also has the secret rare printing from Battles of Legend Heroes Revenge, and although those were at around $20 right after the ban list dropped, they have quickly cooled down to around the $10 mark. The budget holo alternative is the ultra rare, which came out in both Dual Devastator and the 2019 tins. They're not nearly as nice as the secrets, to be honest, but at only $1 each, those are the budget printings that I would pick up for you guys to use. I'd also suggest just grabbing 3 of them for if/when the card eventually goes to 3. Alright guys, we finally have a couple of smaller cards at the tail end of the video here. The first one is Speedroid terrortop. This is a card that went from 1 to 2 as well, and originally this card was hit back in Zodiac format. Now back then, terrortop and Taketamborg were used to make MX Saber Invoker, who could summon a rat peer from the deck and set up your whole combo without burning your initial normal summon, or alternatively it could go into Totem Bird, a walking spell or trap negate that could let you play through back row if you already had a copy of rat peer in your hand. Fast forward to today, and there's nothing that really jumps out about this card that scares me. Yes, you can make a rank 3 or a link 2 monster for free without burning your normal summon, but I guess it'll only be as good as the things that you can make with it, and on top of that you're also running a brick in your deck in the form of Taketamborg. There are 2 decks I'm thinking of that would be able to use this card theoretically. The first one is some variant of Unchained. I know that Sharvara is limited and the deck is probably like a tier 2 or rogue strategy now, but I know some players are going to try to make it work, and I've seen a couple of builds that were experimenting with Cherubini before. This could theoretically give the deck access to Cherubini without committing the normal summon through tour guide. The other deck is Gold Pride Punk. Since Chariot Carry is a generic rank 3 monster, a terrortop engine would give the deck a way to make Chariot Carry for free by just committing the 1 resource out of your hand. I remember back when everyone was looking for this card, I think Super Terrortops were like $20 or something crazy like that when that was the only printing available. Of course, the card being limited to 1 definitely hit its value, but then it basically got a bulk reprint in Synchro Storm as a common. Now, however, we've seen the ultimate rares from OTS Tournament Pack 3 shoot up in price. They were down between $30 and $40, they've shot straight up to the $70 mark. There's also the Super, which was a little bit slower to move up in price. They're the card's only other holo printing. They've historically been about $1 for the last couple of years, but they're now up to $6 to $7 each. I think that this card will eventually see play in something, but with all the hype for Fire decks and then Labyrinth as well, none of which would want to use terrortop, this card will probably go under the radar for a little bit. It's not a bad card to grab a few copies of once the price settles down a little bit, because it will certainly have applications later on within the next couple of formats. And finally, one last card for us to look at today, it is Mind Control. So this is a card that went from 1 to 3. Now, to be honest, I actually thought that this card was at 3 already. I remember this card was at 3 before, and apparently it went to 1 at some point. But really, Mind Control is a card that hasn't been seeing any meta play at all. You take control of a monster, but it can't attack or be tributed. It's basically just a change of heart with restrictions, and even change of heart isn't something that sees play in every single deck. With Snatch Steal now legal, and then Triple Tactics Talent being a thing in the game, I really highly doubt that Mind Control is going to be seeing very much usage, even if the card is at 3. I think that the market reflects this as well. Mind Control is a card that sees play in Edison format, so there was already a reason for the card to be somewhat sought after, but the only really notable price movement for this card was the original super rare promo version from the video game. Near mint copies are really hard to find, so they're like $25 each on TCG Player right now. Aside from that, I guess the gold rare version from Gold Series 2 is around $7 with very few quantities on the market. And then you also have the ultra rare from Legendary Collection Yu-Gi-Oh's World at about $10. But aside from that, all other printings of the card, including like the holos from Dual Devastator, are $1 or less. I think that this is a card that everyone should own a playset of, because there is a chance that maybe you'll want to run a copy or two in the sideboard later on. But definitely don't overreact with the market and go overpay for a card like this if you're hoping that this card will become a mainstay suddenly in the current format. Alright guys, that is all we have for today's episode. Yes, it was an absolutely crazy ban list, but I think it's exactly what we needed. A lot of decks are hit, but it makes room in the game for some cool stuff that we will be getting early in 2024, and it'll also force players to be a little bit more innovative with their decks that we already have access to. Just a reminder, do keep your eye out for a market watch within the next couple of days, where I'm going to talk about cards that were affected by the list but weren't necessarily on the list itself. Anyways guys, if you did enjoy today's market watch, please make sure you let me know by hitting that thumbs up button. Also make sure you leave a comment in the comment section down below and hit subscribe so that you don't miss another video from Tombucks and myself. And until next time guys, don't forget to hold on to your MST.TV.